Hey everybody. I had a question about how to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. So I want to give you a quick example. This is a problem that somebody had on the math lab, and so I want to address how to do this. In our college algebra class, you're not going to need this a whole lot until we get into circles in chapter 2. And at that point, we'll go into a little more detail about it. But I do want to show this example. This one came from the math lab, and so I want to address how to go about solving this equation. So one of the first things we're looking at is if you look at this this 2, it is obviously not a 1, and so before we solve this quadratic equation, we want to have that leading coefficient as a 1. And so what we're going to do to get it to be a 1 is we're simply going to divide every term by 2. So it looks like this. And this gets a little complicated because we get this fraction that's going to be put into our equation. And so now our equation is x squared plus 11 halves x minus 1 half, and 0 divided by 2 is still 0. Now, from here, we want to move our constant to the right-hand side, leave our variables on the left-hand side. And so to do that, we're simply going to add a half on both sides of this equation. And so what happens is we end up with x squared plus 11 over 2x. And I'm going to put plus a blank because we're going to add something to both sides here in a second. And then we have the 1 half plus a blank. Now, from here, we need to figure out what goes in the blank. And so to do that, we're going to take this 11 over 2. So if I can change colors here so we can talk about it. We're going to take this 11 over 2, and we're going to pull it out to the side, divide it by 2, and square it. Okay? So when we do that, here's what's happening. We have this 11 over 2. We're going to divide that by 2, which is the same thing as 2 over 1, and then we're going to square that. Okay, well, when we divide by 2 over 1, that's the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal of 2 over 1, which is 1 half. And so, really, this is 11 over 2 times a half, and then we're still going to square that. And then, as we simplify it, we have 11 over 4, and we're going to square it. We're going to get 121 over 16. This is the number that goes in our blank. Okay, so let's go back over here to where we were. And we're going to put that 121 over 16 into our blank. Now, for a lot of people, this starts to begin to look really complicated. Hopefully, it's not as difficult as it may seem. So what we're going to do from here, I'm going to change colors for a second. Okay. So now what we're going to do is this trinomial that we have on the left-hand side of our equation that you can see here, we are going to factor it into a binomial squared. If we've chosen the number to go in our blank correctly, it factors into a binomial squared. And the first term is going to be x, because x times x would give us the x squared that we see here. And then the sign that we're going to use is whatever this first sign happens to be. So in this case, it's positive. And then the second number is the number that we squared. It's the number that we squared over here. Okay, so this 11 over 4 is the number that we squared. That's what's going to go as that second term in that binomial. So we're going to put the 11 over 4 there. And on the right-hand side, we've got 1 half plus the 121 over 16. To be able to add those, we have to have a common denominator. We need the 2 to be a 16 on bottom. So if we rewrite the 1 half, it's actually 8 over 16 plus 121 over 16. And now we should be able to simplify that a little bit. And on the right hand side, the 8 and 121 get added together. We get 129 over 16. Now, from here, we're ready to find what x is. And so we can do that by taking the square root, using the square root property. When you use the square root property, we're going to end up with x plus 11 over 4. Basically what the square root property says is that if we take the square root of the right-hand side here, then this power is going to go away. Okay, so that's what that's telling us. So when we take the square root, we're going to have the square root of 129 over 16. And we've got to consider that this might be positive or negative. So that's an important part of this. And so as we, again, continue to simplify, we have this x plus 11 over 4 now equals a positive or negative this square root. Well, this square root, we want to separate it and do the root of the top divided by root of the bottom. And so we're going to take the square root of 129 over the square root of 16. And now we just need to simplify. So we've got our x plus 11 over 4 equals a positive or negative. Square root of 129 does not simplify. Square root of 16 does. It simplifies down to 4. And then our last part of this is that we need to get x by itself. And so we're going to subtract 11 over 4. And I'm going to write it out here horizontally because I want you to see that when we add, or in this case subtract the 11 over 4 on the right hand side, we're just going to be able to combine those two fractions because they do have this common denominator of 4. So that's going to be a good thing. So now on the left hand side, the radical and power cancel. I'm sorry, not radical and power. The 11 over 4 minus 11 over 4 is going to cancel. We're going to get x is equal to a negative 11 over 4 plus or minus the square root of 129 over 4. Now, I like to put the constant term in the front. The term with the radical I like to keep as my second term. That's just a personal preference. You don't have to do that. We also could go ahead and combine these two fractions. Because this radical is not going to have an imaginary unit, then we could go ahead and simplify by putting these two fractions together. It's not required we do that, but that is something that is an option. So if we're going to do that, our final answer then would be x equals a negative 11 plus or minus the square root of 129 all over 4. So there's the answer that we're looking for on this particular problem.